Here we are at lecture 4B, and we're going to continue from where we left off in 4A, looking at strategies that photosynthetic organisms have evolved to deal with the stresses of the winter season. Before we get into that, I was just thinking this is always reminding ourselves this is a course in ecology, and it's the scientific study of the interactions of organisms with their biotic and abiotic environments. And so, if I look at this picture here on our title slide, taken a couple of winters ago, um, and thinking about maybe the interactions that this animal had with its biotic and abiotic environment, the stresses that might have been caused by the winter, maybe the stresses that ultimately led to its death, perhaps interactions with prey, so perhaps some coyotes killed it, thinking about the food web that we saw last class and how there are more photoautotrophs than there are things that are eating them. So remember, photoautotrophs would include photosynthetic organisms like grasses, shrubs, trees, annuals, biennials, perennials, woody plants. So today we're looking at winter strategies in woody plants, so trees, and then we'll end today's lecture with a zoology primer, kind of similar to the botany primer that we had last lecture, and this will prime us or get us ready for a discussion on how or some animal strategies for dealing with the stresses of winter. Okay, well, let's take a look at some winter strategies of woody plants, starting with bark. And here we have a micrograph, a picture taken under a microscope. It's a great image. They're just missing one thing, or one important thing, and that's a scale. So I don't know, unless there's some kind of point of reference here, I don't know how big this is. So just like, earlier in the course, we were talking about producing satellite images in reports, and those had a scale to show, how many kilometers maybe a centimeter represents on the image. In this case, a scale would be important to tell us to what extent this has been magnified. But at any rate, what are we seeing in this picture? We see something that's labeled outer bark here. So this is a cross section of some kind of a woody plant, probably a stem of a, let's say, a willow. And, maybe you've had that opportunity of counting the annual growth rings on a stump, and you can get an estimate, a pretty good estimate of how old that tree is, because these represent the growing season. So it looks like this is an example of something that's lived through 4 growing seasons. Okay, so we've got the outer bark, it's dead, and then we've got this inner bark, which, we mentioned the word, or you had the terms vascular and non-vascular plants last class, or last lecture, and we said that vascular plants have vascular tissue like xylem, which transports water and dissolved materials, and phloem, which transports sugars, products of photosynthesis. So this inner portion is that vascular tissue called phloem, and the outer bark is what we're interested in now when we're thinking about maybe its insulative properties for trees. Um, so again, this is not a micrograph now. This is an image I found on the internet. Here's a picture of a tree that was cut down in our yard. And if I look at both of these, I can see what we're talking about in terms of the right here. This is the outer bark. I can see it in here. It's dead, and then as I move further in, I get into this vascular tissue called phloem. And if I go even further in, I get into the wood, the xylem, and that's the vascular tissue that is actively transporting water. And then further into the wood, I see this heartwood. So this is vascular tissue that is no longer functioning for the most part. But this inner bark, really important for the livelihood of the tree. And if you remove it, you could really shorten the lifespan of that tree. Here's a picture of a sign I saw um, this past summer. We were camping in Alberta in one of their provincial parks, and a pretty hefty fine for removing bark. Because again, if you think about that vascular tissue, the phloem vascular tissue, it's found within the inner bark. So if you remove the bark right around the tree, you can really damage the tree and prevent it from um, transporting photosynthetic products like sugars. Okay, well, we're thinking now more about the role of the outer bark in terms of its insulative quality. It's a good insulator because it has a lot of airspace. Maybe you can think back to a few lectures ago when we were looking at the thermal conductivity of different materials, and we saw that air had a very low thermal conductivity, which would mean it is an excellent insulator. Okay, so this bark, outer bark, I just took this quote because I liked it. The outer bark is the tree's protection from the outside world, continually renewed from within. It helps keep out moisture in the rain, prevents the tree from losing moisture when it's dry, like in the wintertime. It insulates against cold and heat and wards off insect enemies. That's the other thing. If you tamper with the bark, you can also make it more susceptible to pests entering and damaging the tree. Something else I just wanted to mention with bark, um, and we have this is again on that camping trip. This is some camping we were doing in the Northwest Territories, and I see some white barked trees here. These are deciduous trees. Remember, deciduous trees lose their leaves at the end of the growing season. And the deciduous trees that we find in the north all tend to have white colored bark. And so maybe you can think back about conversations we've had with regards to the reflective ability of snow when it's fresh and white. It can reflect the sun energy in a greater extent than it can when it gets covered, maybe older snow and it has dirt and topsoil and organic material on it. So I think about the reflective power of a tree that has white bark, probably going to be greater than a tree that has got a darker colored bark. So maybe we try and figure out, well, what advantage does that have to trees in the north in terms of the role it might play in heat in the wintertime. And if you're interested in reading more, I've included this. You can find this journal online. It's the journal called Arctic, and there's a publication in here that I've snipped the abstract out of. It's entitled Reducing Solar Heat Gain During Winter, the Role of White Bark in Northern Deciduous Trees. So why might you want to reduce solar heat gain in the wintertime? Well, it's because you're trying to limit the risk of winter sun scald. So, when you scald something, you subject it to some kind of heat and you get injury to it, right? Maybe you scalded your hand on the frying pan. But here we have winter sun scald. And, um, if these trees can reduce the amount of heat that they're acquiring from the sun because they're lighter colored, then they can reduce this injury that could happen. in that important layer of the bark called the cambium, which, again, if you're interested, you could take a course in botany and learn the role that cambium plays in terms of producing vascular tissue. If you want to get more information about sun scalding, I just snipped this from a Manitoba provincial website looking at agriculture, because they were interested in this case, trying to avoid or prevent winter sun scald in some of the trees that they're growing, maybe in a nursery. Um, and again, you can take a look if you're interested. Click on this and learn more about sun scalding. Okay, so that's bark, great insulative power, all the air spaces, and kind of a general, when I'm thinking about either deciduous or non-deciduous trees, it plays a role in insulating the trees. Okay, we're going to keep going with some of these general winter strategies for for woody plants, and look at this uh, concept called cold acclimation. So I think most of us have probably heard that word acclimate before. Um, so with time, maybe you enter a room and you notice there's a loud fan, and that's the first thing you notice, and it's bothering you, and then maybe after 10-20 minutes you become acclimated to that sound, and it sort of becomes background noise. It's sort of how we're going to use that term when we think about cold acclimation. The woody plants, or these trees, there's some biochemical things that are happening that allow them to acclimate to cold temperatures. And this is a figure that I took from your textbook, and we can see on the x-axis we've got the seasons, or the months of the year, July through November, and on the y-axis here we've got the killing temperature. And in general, this is for woody plants, so this is kind of a general graph, but we can see that in July, pardon me, if all of a sudden a plant in July was all of a sudden subjected to minus 30-degree temperature, or anything below zero, there's a good chance that temperature will kill it. So this is killing temperature on the y-axis. So you can see in July, the temperature needed to kill this tree, this woody plant, is about 0 degrees. And as I progress through the season and get to November, so we're pretty far into the fall here, see that now the killing temperature is much lower. The low minus 20s, let's say. We're getting into the minus 30s. So what is allowing these trees, or these woody plants, to acclimate to these colder temperatures and survive? Really reduce their much lower killing temperature, much colder killing temperature in the winter than in the summertime. Well, one of the things that allows them to acclimate is that they have antifreeze. You can think of it as antifreeze in quotation marks. This time of year, we probably think about antifreeze a fair bit. Make sure it's always topped up in our vehicles. And if you have pets, you may know that antifreeze can be really deadly to plants, to pets, because the antifreeze that we're using in our vehicles is toxic to mammals, like cats and dogs. And you might wonder, why would a cat or dog want to drink it if it was spilt on the driveway? Like if there was oil spilt, well, that presents other environmental problems, but cats and dogs don't tend to rush to drink oil. But with antifreeze, it's really sweet tasting. I don't know if anyone has had the unfortunate opportunity to siphon antifreeze and get some in their mouth. That's not advisable. You should never mouth siphon, but if you've done that in an emergency setting, maybe for your vehicle, maybe you've realized how sweet antifreeze is. In fact, there are laws either pending or in place in some jurisdictions that require that a terrible tasting additive be added to antifreeze to prevent animals from drinking it, and also to prevent it being used by people to poison other people. So if you're interested, there's stories there you can read about in the news. Anyways, that's a little off track, but what's happening with antifreeze is, well, in our vehicle, it prevents fluids from freezing up in our coolants from freezing in our vehicle, because it lowers. So if you just have water in your as a coolant, I'm sure that might work in the summertime in your car, but come winter, that coolant, that water coolant, is going to freeze. But we can lower the freezing point by adding antifreeze to it. And what antifreeze does, just like if you add salt to the roads, you can start to melt the ice, because, well, you're reducing or you're lowering the freezing point of water. Because if you think back to that lecture on how water moves from a liquid to a solid, it forms those crystalline structures. But if you have additives in your water, so you don't have pure water, you're gonna have to remove more energy, cooler temperatures to allow for freezing, because you got these other impurities like antifreeze in those systems. So with trees, one of the ways they can acclimate to colder temperatures is that they convert starch into sugar in their cells, and these sugars end up performing like a sweet antifreeze, and they lower the freezing point. And you can think about why you don't want liquids freezing, or you don't want water freezing in your plant tissues, is because when water freezes, goes from a liquid to a solid, it becomes less dense, takes up more volume, and just like that glass of water left outside, as the water expands, it can crack the glass, or it can crack the plant cells. In fact, in the lab, we use this, if we're wanting to do a chlorophyll analysis, an analysis of this photosynthetic pigment that's in cells. In order to break up the cells, sometimes we'll freeze the material, and that freezing lyses or cracks the cells and releases the chlorophyll. So sweet antifreeze is one way that trees can acclimate to winter temperatures. Another way is that their cell membranes can become more pliable, more flexible, and this is explained well in this figure, also from your textbook. So we see here's a cell, and maybe you recall from other biology classes you may have had, if we look at a cell from a plant, it has a rigid cell wall made out of something called cellulose. And our bodies can't digest cellulose, and so when we eat something with a lot of cellulose, we don't digest it. And in nutrition circles, we'd call that fiber. So that cell wall here, it's really rigid, and then on the inside of the cell wall, we've got this cell membrane, which is more flexible. And as these trees are acclimating to colder temperatures, their cell membrane can become more, I guess you can use the word flexible. So I see here in this intercellular space, so the space between cells, we got some water, and as it was freezing, got colder out, started to freeze, and this ice crystal is developing. It pushes through the cell wall, but look, it kind of just squeezes in. You can think of one of those stress balls maybe that you have when you squish it in. Now you have a flexible cell membrane because of these changes, and the cell won't rupture. So that's another way trees can acclimate to colder temperatures as the season progresses into winter. And the third way is this idea of a glass. It's been described as a glass phase of water. So the maybe not just water, but whatever is dissolved in the water, this liquid cell, the liquid portion of the cell becomes really viscous, and it becomes super cooled, and then instead of forming crystals, you just kind of maintain this interesting glass phase, and that as such, the in the cold temperatures, the liquid, the water, doesn't expand so much and damage the cells because it's still kind of performing as a super cooled liquid. Very interesting. Again, the biochemistry and the physics of this goes beyond this course, but if you're interested, um, I've included this article here. It's a mini review. It's looking at the molecular control of cold acclimation in trees. And here's another article that looks at the overview of the cold hardiness in woody plants. Okay, so those are kind of some general winter strategies for woody plants. Thinking about the bark, thinking about cold acclimation. And now we'll look at more specific winter strategies seen in deciduous trees. These are trees that lose their leaves at the end of the growing season. And why do they do that? Well, they do that to reduce. Remember, you've got the cold stress and you've got this desiccation stress in the wintertime. So with no leaves now, you have less likelihood of losing water from those leaves. So it's a great strategy that deciduous trees use. And, this picture looks like this is a cottonwood picture taken in the wintertime. But before that, we probably know that we see color changes typically in most deciduous trees, both cottonwood. But here we have a really pretty tree. This tree's in our front yard, and we can see it changing color as summer progresses into fall. And well, why is it changing color? I think some of us probably have heard about this process before, but chemical messengers called hormones. We've got hormones in our bodies and other animal bodies, and we also have hormones in plants, like this tree. And there's certain hormones, depending on the balance of hormones, there's a trigger based on, the tree can sense the shortening of the daylight or the sunlight hours as we go from summer into fall. And that triggers a balance of these couple of hormones that signal or that cause the leaves of this tree to fall. But before they do, in a lot of trees, we often see brilliant color changes. And I know places like the Pemmican Valley Provincial Park is a hot spot for these tree tourists every fall. I think a lot of them only go out there in the fall and they do a drive-through and they see the tremendous changes in color to these deciduous trees in the fall. And the reason why, well, these colors were there all year, all summer long, but they were masked by a more larger abundance of this photosynthetic pigment called chlorophyll. And we talked about this earlier in an earlier lecture when we were looking at photosynthesis. But chlorophyll is green. But when this leaf starts to be kind of cut off from the rest of the tree, the chlorophyll is no longer being produced, and chlorophyll, that molecule, is often the first one to be broken down. So once the chlorophyll is gone, then we can start to see these other pigments, these other colors, like colors that turn this tree yellow, or maybe other trees red, or some other trees orange. If the so losing the leaves on a deciduous tree in the fall going into the winter, really great strategy for preventing water loss. And they don't need, these are the key or the chief photosynthetic unit or structure is the leaf, right? It's this it captures all this sunlight. Well, going into the winter time, sunlight hours are much reduced. You're also wanting to limit your water loss because when you have photosynthesis occurring, you have to open up the leaf to the atmosphere. for gas exchange, and when you do so, you also open it up for water loss. So to limit that, the tree acclimates to the wintertime, and part of that acclimation, we saw how it deals with cold in previous slides, but it also loses its leaves to reduce desiccation. Sometimes we'll get snowfall before the leaves have fallen, and here's that same tree, and this can really prevent snow load stress on the tree. And if you're not in a yard, if the tree is somewhere in a natural setting, in a forest, that might lead to a lot of branches snapping off. The trees in our yard, if this ever happens, I usually just go out with a broom and knock off the snow load so we don't get branches breaking off. So that's another way, I guess, with deciduous trees. If they can lose those leaves before the snow falls, it can limit the damage due to snow load stress. Oftentimes, too, when we think about wind, you know, um, if it's really windy out and maybe it's in the fall after the leaves have fallen, there's a lot less chance of branches snapping because the wind's blowing through these leafless trees as opposed to being stopped by the leaves like a sail and maybe bending and breaking the branches. Okay, well, that's thinking about deciduous trees and them losing their leaves. Um, let's move on now to non-deciduous trees. And uh, these things keep their leaves year round. Here's a picture I took on the road up to, well, it's the winter road up to Lac Brochet and Dooley Lake. Um, and if I look at this picture, it was definitely in the wintertime. You see all this snow. I can see some trees with their leaves on them, and I see some trees without. So I know that maybe some of these trees that don't have their leaves on them, well, some of them might be dead. But if I look closely, there's probably some coniferous trees that have lost their leaves, but they're still alive. And we mentioned earlier that tamaracks, also known as larch, are a coniferous tree, meaning that they have cones, like maybe you want to call them pine cones, but they don't keep their leaves year round. But we're going to focus on non-deciduous trees, so we're emphasizing it. These are trees that keep their leaves year round, like these trees here. So we mentioned that deciduous trees, they want to prevent water loss, desiccations in the winter, so they lose their leaves. But what about non-deciduous trees that keep their leaves? Well, their leaf structure is such that it has characteristics that really limit water loss. And these include things like, well, they have a really good cuticle. I see a cuticle on other deciduous tree leaves as well, but this cuticle and this is, what are we looking at here? This is a cross section of a needle. So a leaf, needle-like leaf, coming from a non-deciduous tree. So it's a cross section. This is maybe what it would look like under a microscope. Again, it should have a scale associated with it, but it doesn't. But um, we can see a thick cuticle that's going to limit water loss. We also see that the shape of the leaf itself has a really reduced surface area. So if you reduce surface area, right? If I think of that broad leaf on that maple tree, for instance, well, there's a lot of surface area where water can evaporate or be lost through evaporative transpiration to the environment, to the atmosphere. But if I get this long needle-shaped leaf, I've really reduced the surface area, and that's going to help prevent water loss. And then it says here stomata, found within depressions on needle surface, reduces water loss. Well, what is a stomata? I'm looking, I can't even find that word here, but I see a word that looks like it's stoma. So stomata is the plural for stoma. Stoma actually means, I think the origin of this word means little mouth. So I see these little mouths, and here's a stoma, or these stomata, and these are openings where a gas exchange occurs. Why does the leaf need gas exchange? Well, for photosynthesis, because if you think about the products, what are the reactants of photosynthesis? water was one, or is one, and carbon dioxide is the other. And where do they get the carbon dioxide from? From the atmosphere. And how is it going to get in? If it has this waxy cuticle, well, it's not. And that is why they have these little mouths, or these little openings called stomata, or stoma, singular. But I can see in this needle-like leaf that they're sort of indented to some extent here in the cuticle, and that's going to help prevent water loss as well. If we think about snow load and these non-deciduous trees, we talked about how deciduous trees lose their leaves, and so typically they've lost their leaves when it's by the time it snows, so you're limiting snow load. But with these non-deciduous trees, they keep their leaves year round. But what we see, like this picture here, taken in the NWT, we get this really spire form, like a church spire, really pronounced in these trees. And so if snow falls, it kind of gets directed downwards and it isn't accumulating. Although your book describes how there was one Douglas fir non-deciduous tree in Finland where they were looking at a study, and they showed that it was carrying a snow load of 3,000 kilograms. That's hard to imagine, um, but that snow load can really play a role in snapping trees, and so some of these trees have evolved this really spire form so that it prevents snow from building up. Sometimes, though, that snow will build up. Here's a picture I took. Looks like I'm not sure what caused this tree to buckle. It could have been an extremely huge snow load. Because if I look at this, it broke this in this direction, but if I look at the tree behind it, it's missing uh, branches on this side. So if I'm thinking about the stress here, I'm looking at the abrasive force of blowing ice particles. So we got wind, probably predominant wind coming from this direction here, and it looks like it's impacted this tree in the back, above the snow, slightly above the snow, and the branches that are on the windward side seem to be killed or removed. And so for trees that are all crumpled or damaged like this, we can use this a word that's of German origin. So if you're a German speaker, pardon my pronunciation, Krummholz, and I believe the translation is this means like damaged or crumpled or bent, and Holz is, I think, referring to wood. So we can have that take a number of forms, like this flag tree, where it kind of looks like a flag or a banner because we just have branches on one side of the tree. That may have been caused by the abrasive force of blowing ice particles. Well, to kind of deal with this abrasive force of these ice particles that blow close to the ground, or above the, I should say, above the surface of the snow, some woody trees, some non-deciduous trees like black spruce, demonstrate something called phenotypic plasticity. So some of you may have taken a course where phenotypic plasticity has been defined. Basically, it's trees can look different. The phenotype, that's how what they look like, how their genes are expressed, and how we see them. It can be plastic, or it can have different forms depending on maybe the environmental conditions it's being exposed to. So this is an image taken from your textbook, and it talks about how this wind and this abrasive ice can create like tufted trees. So these tufts are kind of above that zone that's causing the damage to the branches. Or in some cases, this is a black spruce as well, we can have this really um, truncated or prostrate uh, growth here. I'm going to make sure I have the right spelling here. Um, and where it's growing close to the ground and it is growing prostrate to the ground. And as such, the snow is covering it completely, and it is being protected by the snow cover from the abrasive force of wind carrying those ice particles. Okay, well, that was a little intro then to think about winter strategies seen in woody plants, both deciduous and non-deciduous trees. We're going to switch gears now to zoology, the study of animals. And what is an animal? I think most of us could name many animals, and hopefully you would include yourself in that because humans are animals. The definition of an animal is a multicellular, so more than one cell, eukaryotic, so having a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles, things maybe we haven't talked about in this class, but this should ring a bell for some people who've taken biology. And they're heterotrophic. We have mentioned heterotrophs before because, well, we were looking at photoautotrophs, plants, for example, that can make their own food through accessing the energy of the sunlight. Hetero means different or apart from. So a heterotroph has to feed, troph means to feed, has to feed apart from itself. And the other thing that is needed to be an animal is that they need to be motile, at least in some point of their life cycle. So hopefully if you look at these, I snipped this from a website that had boreal shield animals. Hopefully you can see that these animals here, and I'm guessing you have a common name for all of them in your head, that they meet all of these checkpoints. This last kind of criterion here, they need to be motile at some point in their life cycle. It's something important to remember when we think of things maybe like animals that are sessile as adults, meaning that they don't move. So we typically see these in aquatic environments. And I'm thinking about things like the invasive zebra mussel. So as an adult, here we got this adult. It's an animal. Let's see, it's multicellular. Yes. It's eukaryotic. Sure, I'd have to look at its cells under a microscope, but I'll tell you it is. And it's a heterotroph. It can't photosynthesize. And it has to be motile at some point in its life cycle. Well, it's not motile really here as an adult, but I see as a larva, this state in its life cycle called a veliger. As a veliger, it is motile. You can see it swimming around. Okay. Now, if you're interested in zoology, doing these promos, we teach a zoology course here. Offered it last winter. I think it's on a 2-year rotation. So look for it if you're interested. And if you take that course, wow, then we can really get into the taxonomy. Remember how scientists are grouping things. So we looked kind of at a little bit at the taxonomy with regards to botany, and we were grouping, the algae and the moss and the lichen and the non-vascular and vascular plants. Well, with animals, wow, here are a bunch of different ways, or a bunch of different groups of animals. These are all animals, and if you look at this, some of these things you'd probably say, well, that looks like a worm. Okay, sure, that looks like a worm. Okay, so maybe we have things that we can recognize like worms. This looks like a caterpillar. Oh, well, that's not a caterpillar, but this looks like maybe like a fly. Here's a snail, a sea star. There's another. It looks like another worm. Okay, and here we have a frog. Zoology, the study of animals, often focuses on the taxonomy and figuring out why we group the animals in this way. So it's very interesting, and I encourage you if this piques your interest, this primer, then consider taking that course in the future. But we're gonna just talk about, we're thinking about winter ecology, the stresses of winter, the cold, the desiccation or the dryness. So let's look at we just spent time looking at how photosynthetic organisms handle the stress. Let's see how some general ways that animals do so. To do this, we'll think about maybe a couple of terms that might be new to us. So let's first consider temperature. We just got through thinking about how trees deal with temperature changes, and they have that cold acclimation, which was fascinating. But with animals, some animals, we're going to use the term ectotherm. So there is that prefix or that uh, root of the word therm. Remember, we saw it when we looked at um, thermally stratified lakes. So we know it has to do with temperature and heat. So an ecto means out, away from, or outside of. So ectotherms rely primarily on their external environment to regulate their body temperature. So here's a great shot of a northern leopard frog, and you can click on this article. That's where I got this picture from, and it's talking about these leopard frogs and loss of their habitat. But they're going to be a good example of an ectotherm, where they don't really have the ability to um, regulate their body temperature from inside, and so they have to rely on the external temperatures in their environment to determine their body temperatures, ectotherms. And then I think I've already used this term in the last slide. We have endotherms, endo from within, regulate body temperature by producing heat within the body. They can do this by increasing their metabolic rate as the temperature drops. I hope you recognize this reaction. Arrow is pointing in this direction, and I just blotted out the photosynthesis because I want to think about cellular respiration. We had this in a couple lectures ago, and I can see that cellular respiration, right? We're burning stuff, we need oxygen, we're releasing, we're breaking these bonds, and we're releasing that energy, and some of that energy becomes stored as ATP. This is the energy currency of the cell, and some of it is heat energy. And this heat energy can help warm and regulate and keep your body temperature. You're an endotherm. It can help ensure that your body temperature remains at a within the limits of a natural system for yourself, whatever that range is. Okay. Well, if I go back to this slide or this picture, I wonder if you could guess which of these animals are ectotherms and which of these animals are endotherms. I'll let you answer that one on your own. Okay, so just some more general ideas of how animals can deal with the stresses of winter, those cold and water loss stresses. So animals can have these insulative layers, like this raven here sitting at the top of this tree, thinking about the insulative properties of things like feathers. And we know that humans can use feathers. We use them in probably some of our most expensive and most effective clothing, or parkas are made with goose feathers. We think of Canada Goose, who has factories here in Winnipeg. Um, so that insulative layer found in the feathers we can also use for our human clothing. Okay. Um, so I actually took this picture in Winnipeg, not in Churchill, in Winnipeg. I wish I had seen some wild polar bears, but these are polar bears in the zoo. And hopefully, some of you have had that experience to go to the Churchill exhibit. Maybe some of you had the fortunate enough to actually see polar bears in Churchill. But we can think about um, the insulative layer, or the properties of polar bear fur, really interesting with their hair. And for this course, because we're a little further south than than the ecozone that we'd find polar bears in naturally. Um, we probably won't spend too much time talking about polar bear fur or hair and its qualities, but really interesting. Um, what we do have in the boreal shield ecozone are black bears, and they have fur. And they also, well, the polar bears also have fat as well, but I have this slide in here for fat. Um, this picture of this black bear was probably taken in the springtime based on what this thing is eating. Um, it's eating some wetland vegetation, um, and that's sometimes the first stuff that comes out after these guys are looking for food in the springtime when they've come out of their dens. But they really want to fatten up because that fat provides a great insulation for them. Okay, we're going to get into much more detail on animal strategies for dealing with the winter. I'm just kind of covering some of the real uh, high-level general aspects. So we talked about desiccation, drying out, being another stress in the wintertime. And, you know, uh, here, this has obviously been a stress for all terrestrial environments, all terrestrial animals coping with water loss. And the way they do it is to have these desiccation resistant coverings. So I can look at this beautiful moth and think about its exoskeleton. So it's got its skeleton on the outside, has to go through a time where it actually outgrows its skeleton and must have to molt. But these exoskeletons are made of a material called chitin, which is really good at, well, it's a really good protective covering. It's a great place to anchor your muscles, but it also prevents water loss, and it allows these things to live in a terrestrial environment. It allows them also to limit water loss in the wintertime. And then I can think about desiccation resistance in skin coverings that have keratin in them, these keratin structures. So looking at this slide here that I took from my zoology class, I can see that there's a wide variety of these keratin structures in mammals like ourselves or like that bear, in aves like that raven, and in non-avian reptiles, perhaps like that turtle I showed you. So these structures can help protect, provide a really great covering, and they can also help with reducing water loss. Okay, well, we're going to, in lecture 5A, pick up here and look at some specific strategies that animals have evolved to deal with the stresses of the winter. See you then.